Back on July 5th, Mike Winger posted this tweet where he responds to a shocking claim from a British Muslim cleric who defends using and having sex slaves. And based upon that shocking and offensive teaching from this one Muslim cleric, Mike Winger invokes this as evidence that Islam is a false religion. Not, of course, that he's claiming Islam is solely a false religion because of this British cleric, but rather I take it that this is just more rotten fruit from a rotten tree. So then Dan McClellan responds to that and he retweets Mike Winger's tweet, but then he comments, just a reminder that God commands Israelites to take sex slaves in the book of Numbers. Exodus 21 describes how sex slavery is supposed to work. The Bible never once questions or condemns the practice of slavery. I take it that what Dan McClellan is doing here is pointing out, and this is a metaphor I just used in a recent video, one ought not throw stones in glass houses. By the way, that album Glass Houses, Billy Joel, great album. So the idea here is that if if your religion has the same problems as this other religion, don't criticize the other religion for those problems when your religion also has those problems. When Christianity has within its history, within its holy text, passages that can be used to justify slavery and sex slavery, then you shouldn't critique Islam as a false religion for the evidence that people defend sex slavery within Islam. Because, of course, not only do we have this in the Judeo-Christian Bible, but Judeo-Christian Bible, so the Hebrew scriptures in particular, which are part of the Christian Bible, put it that way. But you also have Christians, of course, defending slavery throughout much of history down to the 19th century. So I think what Dan McClellan is inviting us to do here is maybe to not only be internally consistent with ourselves, but also recognize how Christians rationalize and explain the evidence for these horrific things within their tradition, and then extend that same grace to Muslims and recognize that Islam is also a living, evolving, emerging religious tradition in which there are people of good faith representing what they profess to be their Muslim faith who reject the very same horrific elements that Christians reject in their tradition, whether it be 19th century defenses of antebellum slavery or whether it be references to the enslavement of people and sex slavery in the Bible. This then prompted Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy to provide a long tweet by way of reply. And I want to be very clear that at this point, I'm just going to focus in on that first section he has for the sake of time. So he says, um, because Dan McClellan referred to numbers, so Michael replies and says, on numbers, I assume chapter 31, Robert Alter says, the command is not from God. Quote, Moses' command, one should note that it is Moses, not God's, to perpetuate this general massacre. And then Michael moves on and talks about other issues. And I just want to camp on this for the remainder of this short video. So for the Christian who has a dilemma here, pardon me. So the dilemma is the same thing as a modern Muslim who rejects slavery and sex slavery, believes in bodily autonomy and things like that, and they have to wrestle with both elements of the Quran, of the Hadith, of the traditions of Islam, and also the contemporary teaching of some fundamentalist clerics. They have to figure out how to reconcile that with their endorsement of these rejection of sex slavery and slavery generally, et cetera, to the affirmation of bodily autonomy. The same thing for Christians. Christians have to do the same thing. And how do you reconcile that gap, that tension? And one way of doing so, Michael is suggesting here, is to note that God didn't actually command what Moses did and commanded in Numbers 31. Just note a few problems with that. And let's just start with the text. So I'm not going to look at all of it, but just let's look at we call the gist of it, Numbers 31, 17, and 18. Kill all the boys. This is Moses. It is true. It is Moses speaking, not God saying, tell the Israelites this, but Moses himself speaking. Kill all the boys. Kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Okay. And this is what would seem that Dan McClellan is alluding to is sex slavery. So I want to just make a couple distinctions here. First of all, when some people think sex slavery, honestly, when I hear the term sex slavery, what I'm inclined to think is of something like Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, quote unquote, comfort women. So women that were kidnapped in World War II by the Japanese army and then kept in small huts, and soldiers would line up day after day and they would rape them, and that is sex slavery. And one of the particularly horrific examples, right, which I will say remains in 2025 an open, unhealed wound in relationships between Japan and these other countries. So that is sex slavery. Uh, that's not what's being described here, right? What's being described here is not that horrific, but it's still horrific. The example I always give by analogy is think of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. So this 10 years ago, this was they were in the news quite a bit. They were a Muslim group and they would invade Christian villages, kill the men and women, and kidnap the girls for themselves, and then marry them off to Muslim men. That's like what the Israelites are doing here. So they're killing all of the Midianite men, all of the married women, women who are not virgins, and boys, but they're kidnapping those girls, maybe 15, 16 years old, who have not, they're still virgins, and then they're marrying them off. And if we read more in the text, it talks about how they're given 30 days to mourn the massacre of their family, the destruction of all they've ever known, and now they have to marry the men. Now, part of the issue as to why that is uh, a word that we haven't yet used, but why that would also constitute rape, which is implied by sex slavery, is that um, a girl, I mean, anybody, but let's just say, 15, 16-year-old girl who's just witnessed her family massacred and then mourns for 30 days and then is told, now you can marry one of the men who potentially massacred your family. We come to the issue of consent, which I've talked about a year ago. I was doing a fair number of videos on this topic. And today we recognize that in order to have sexual consent, one must be able to consent, and consent must be given active and ongoing. And those are the three elements that you find with respect to sexual consent time and again throughout uh, North American legal codes. Ability to consent, and active and ongoing enthusiastic consent. Then the question is this: Can a 15 or 16-year-old girl who just witnessed her family massacred freely consent? Are they in a position where they could freely choose to marry one of the men who had massacred their family and terrorized them and caused them untold grief and horror and anguish? And the answer clearly is no. You cannot freely consent to that. So they would certainly agree to do it, but it wouldn't be free. It would inevitably be coerced. And that's where the idea of rape in particular comes in and is added as a distinct factor. Because then any coital activity, any sexual activity that occurs between this man who's now married to this 15, 16-year-old girl and the girl constitutes rape insofar as she's not consenting to it, nor did she consent to have her family massacred and to be kidnapped. The whole thing is horrific, bottom line. And what I always like to do to my Christian friends is to say, just put what you are reading here in Numbers 31 into the present day. Imagine that you read in the Associated Press or Reuters some news report coming out from some place in the Middle East or North Africa or the Far East, somewhere in the world, where one group has invaded another group, massacred the entire village, and kidnapped the teenage girls and then married them off to the army. What would you think in that situation? Would you think that was a war crime, a crime against humanity, that was grossly evil? Of course you would, which is why you should think the same here. Now, Michael Jones' defense, just and in fairness, it's just one excerpt of one tweet, and I'm not looking at everything he said on this topic by any means, but that one response is to say, well, but God didn't command it. To which I say, God is also silent in condemning it. That's a significant problem because God is pretty active in the Bible in condemning things of which God does not approve. There's a twofold prayer of confession. The prayer for the sins of omission and sins of commission. The sins of commission is to pray forgiveness for the things you ought not to have done. The sins of omission is to pray for forgiveness for things you did not do that you should have done. If you see something horrific being carried out in another person and you do nothing, you have committed a sin of omission by failing to speak out on something for which you should have spoken out. God is here modeling the sin of omission by not condemning Moses when he is so ready to condemn Moses and the Israelites and to judge them with fire, with a chasm opening up in the ground and swallowing up human beings. God will judge them fiercely for things that they do wrong. But when it comes to massacring the Midianites and taking young girls as sex slaves, God is silent. That's a significant problem. I mean, it's worse than that. So when you go to Hebrews 11 and it appropriates the story of Moses, the story of Moses, the life of Moses as a model is here. There's only good things. There's nothing bad. And in particular, like if you had a leader in your religious community who had carried out a genocidal slaughter, which is what is described in Numbers 31, that meets the definition, classic definition of genocide. There are four parts of genocide back to the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, and it meets that definition to a T. If you had a leader that committed genocide and you were silent on the sins and the crimes of that individual and only lauded them and praised them for the good things that they had done, that would be indefensible. And that's the role of Moses within the tradition. I mean, he's condemned for getting angry and striking a rock to get water out of it, but there's no equivalent judgment for him committing genocidal slaughter and taking sex slaves of the Midianites. That is a significant problem. So the thing is this, and this brings me full circle to the beginning and to Dan McClelland's point, I take it again, about throwing stones in glass houses. Christians have learned how to read these texts. Either they read them in a way that just leaves them with a deep cognitive dissonance, or they've learned to read them in, I think, a more helpful, progressive way that helps them to resolve these difficulties and remove the gap between their own moral understanding and what they're reading in the text. And what Dan McClelland, I take it, would be inviting apologists, Christian apologists like Mike Winger to do, who then condemn Islam and say, look, rotten tree, rotten fruit, is to say, you could argue the same thing with Christianity, rotten tree, rotten fruit. But if you're going to find ways to reconcile what you read in Numbers 31 with your own Christian beliefs, extend that same grace, golden rule, extend that same grace to Muslims and explore not how some wacko cleric in Britain is defending sex slavery, which is just your confirmation bias against Islam at play, but look for the ways that progressive Muslims are reading these passages in a way that condemns those actions rather than justifies them. To conclude, I did a debate on some of these topics last year with David Lamb and with the Analytic Christian, hosted by the Analytic Christian. And I'm going to link that below if you're interested in hearing more about some of these topics.